Hi, I'm John Allen, the editor of Crux and a media and communications fellow at the Word on Fire Institute. Recently, I published a book with the Institute called Catholics in Contempt: How Catholic Media Are Fielding Today's Fights in the Church and What to Do About It. We are going to take advantage of Bishop Barron's presence here in Rome for the Synod of Bishops on Synodality to talk about the culture of contempt in today's media and what the proper Catholic response to that ought to be. It's going to be a fascinating conversation, so please stay tuned. Bishop Barron, first of all, let's focus on the irony that this is basically your show. I mean, this is your media space, but I'm interviewing you, so you're basically renting me your audience for free tonight in an act of extraordinary generosity. So
That's exactly right. At the end of a long day at the Synod, I'm happy to have you interview me instead of the other way around.
So, I recently did a book for your institute, the Word on Fire Institute, on Catholics and contempt, right? And the idea that there is a culture of contempt in today's media environment. Now, you would think, having done a book like that I would have a handy-dandy, nice and neat definition of contempt with which we could begin. Truth of it is, what I've got is the Potter-Stewart test. I'm not sure I can define it, but I know it when I see it.
Hear it or see it.
But let me start with this. It seems to me that media contempt is about not just attacking ideas, but attacking people. That is, when you have someone with whom you disagree, it's not enough merely to reject their idea or to critique the idea. But you have to critique the decency and the integrity of the person propounding that idea. Does that seem to you like a good working definition of contempt?
I do, and one of the problems, John, I think is people don't know how to have arguments anymore. What I mean is to formulate a real argument, to bring evidence to bear, to assess the evidence, to take your opponent's position seriously, even to steelman it, to respond to objections, etc., to draw conclusions in a reasonable way. That's called an argument. And most people, I find, don't even know how to do that. So the fallback position, the default position is, well, you're an idiot. I'm going to attack you personally. And and that's where the contempt side comes in. Nothing in the world wrong with disagreeing with someone's argument and making a counter-argument. My hero, St. Thomas Aquinas, was a master at that. Avoided the ad hominem always, the attack against the person. Thomas never does that. He'll try to dismantle someone's argument or show a flaw in it. We've lost the art of argument, which I've been saying for a long time, and we default to this facile ad hominem style. That's the problem.
By the way, anyone who ever wants to say Catholic clergy in the 21st century are out of touch, I just want to note, you just used the phrase steel man in a phrase. So clearly you're in touch with the argot of our time. So let me ask you this. I mean, you are a very high-profile person yourself. I mean, your YouTube videos generate millions of views. You did the Catholicism series that is one of the most celebrated TV productions about the Catholic Church in our time. And although all of that has played basically to overwhelmingly positive responses, I mean, you have also drawn some fire publicly, and ironically enough, comes from both the left and the right a lot. So you yourself have experienced what we might call the culture of contempt. What has your experience of that been like? And when you experience that, in other words, when you feel somebody's not just attacking your argument, which I know you feel is fair game, but when somebody's attacking you personally, how do you respond to that?
I remember in the early days when I first started on YouTube, and I put these videos up, I didn't even know that people could make comments on YouTube videos. And I was excited when we got 300 views, and I'd look and say, oh my goodness, people have actually made comments. And of course, especially in those days, most of the commentary was extremely negative. This was the high water mark of the new atheist period, and anything about God or involving the church. And I was appalled at first, I must say. I wasn't expecting it. I was moving before that in the world of academe for the most part. I was writing books and articles and, engaging in high-level conversations and listening to counter-arguments. When you do it in this more, popular setting, you're going to get this sort of negativity. So at first, I was sort of appalled by it. Then I got accustomed to it and got a thicker skin. And what I decided to do was take advantage of it. that at least it gave me a toehold. So I send something out into the ether, and back come these comments. And I don't even know who these people are. There's no name attached, there's no face attached, but there's a human being there. They hate me and they hate God or hate religion, but at least I can connect to them somehow. So I started to use it. Once I got over the shock of being personally attacked, I started to use it then as a way in. I say, hey, well, okay, fair enough, I get that, but what you're missing is X, Y, and Z. So that's what I did, in the beginning. Something I'm actually proud of is that I do get attacked from both left and right. And I would dare say more than maybe any other major public Catholic figure, I get it from both sides of the spectrum, which I'm happy about, because I think it does show that I've staked out, and I've said it, I stand in the great Vatican II tradition as interpreted by the great post-conciliar popes from Paul VI to Francis, the Catechism of 92. I mean, that's where I stand, and I come out of that perspective. Well, you got the hard left and the hard right, both hate that tradition. So fair enough, bring it on.
Does it sting more when this kind of criticism comes from within the Catholic fold? People that, in a sense, you would think ought to know better?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. And, it's terrible to say in a way, but I think it's true. The nastiness is greater coming from inside the Catholic world than from outside. I think at one point I said some years ago, give me my early atheist critics any day over my Catholic critics. Because they were obnoxious their own way too, but there was something particularly nasty about the intra-ecclesial Catholic stuff.
And so let me ask you, do you think that is different today than it was, say, a decade ago or 2 decades ago? I mean, your lifespan overlaps that of 6 popes, right? You were born when John the 23rd was pope,
Yeah.
right? I was born when Paul VI was pope,
Yeah.
right? And so we've both seen some
covered
water
a lot
under
of
the
popes.
bridge, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, I remember, Paul VI, like, some of the criticism that came his way, particularly after Humanae Vitae in 1968, was incredibly vicious.
Yeah.
I started my career at the National Catholic Reporter in the 1990s, and some of the things that were being said on the editorial pages of that newspaper about John Paul II and then Cardinal Ratzinger at the Congregation for the Faith, were fairly contemptuous.
Oh, yeah.
And so the question is there anything different about what's happening today, or is it simply louder?
Yeah, I would tend, I think, to that latter view. Everything's been made worse by the social media world. What I mean, not everything, I mean this problem of critique and contempt has been made worse by the social media world. The ease with which you can send something out. You don't have to write a letter, type it out, find an address and a stamp and send it to an editor. You can sit in your mom's basement and you can just type something out immediately.
Which people actually do,
of course,
by the way.
Yeah, of course. And the anonymity of it, that you can do it without getting yourself personally in trouble and an immediate reaction. That's made it worse. And then that is like this sort of terrible toxic waste dump, because this comment comes out and then wait a minute, and then someone comes back and then a mob might form around it. That's worse now, yes, than it was, let's say, when John Paul II was being attacked by his left-wing critics. It's worse because of the social media environment.
But worse in the sense of it's simply more ubiquitous? Or do you think the culture itself has become more toxic, more acrimonious, more unrelenting?
Yeah, I do, because the social media has begun to shape us. So it begins as a tool, and this is always the case with great technological advances. It begins as a tool, and then it starts to shape us. And so, yeah, I do think it's the ease with which we can communicate our invective to others, the ease with which mobs can form on social media has made the whole environment worse and has made those of us who participate in it worse. I think that's true. Now, I mean, human nature is human nature. People have always been fallen and obnoxious and difficult with their enemies. But this environment has exacerbated the situation.
I will freely confess that among many of my colleagues, I am seen as something of a dinosaur because I am very anti-social media.
Yeah.
I always say that, I don't know if you ever played the game Asteroids back in the day,
Yeah.
but, this video game, they had something called a smart bomb where you could, I think 2 times during the game, you could press this button and just wipe everything away and start over. Like, if I had that capacity, I would press that button now and go back to a pre-social media stage, because I do think
Yeah.
it has had a kind of toxic impact on our interaction with one another. Now, of course, that's unrealistic. You can't do that.
Right.
But I do think, I mean, McLuhan, right? The medium is the message.
Yeah.
I mean, no technology is value-free. And it does seem to me that social media inculcates a certain set of values, which is rapid response, right? I mean, you mentioned Aquinas.
Yeah.
Aquinas famously said that cognition is a three-step process. There is experience, there is reflection on experience, and then there is judgment, right? So you experience something, you think about it, and then you reach a conclusion. It seems to me, in the world we live in social media, that intermediary step of reflection has just been eviscerated.
Yes, and that's tied to what I said about argumentation. That people don't know how to make an argument, because argumentation depends upon the process you're describing. And in the measure that that's disappeared, the capacity for real argument has disappeared, and so we default to this rather toxic, position. That's a cultural thing. I mean, teaching people again how, think of Lonergan, who was a great student of Aquinas. Be attentive, be intelligent, be reasonable, and then be responsible. The 4 steps in any responsible engagement of the world. Be attentive. What's actually there in front of you? Be intelligent, meaning try to understand it, see the form. Be reasonable means make a judgment, as you say, a correct judgment about the nature of things. And then be responsible, act in accord with that judgment. That's a real spiritual discipline. And Lonergan, who was an epistemologist, but he was also a spiritual teacher, that's a spiritual practice. And the social media, I think, does indeed undermine the requisite spirituality, right, to make an argument and to engage somebody in a creative way. See, one thing about argument is when you're appealing to some objective truth, you're finding something that will link you to another person. So it's not like just my private set of convictions are against yours, so I'm going to attack you because you don't like me. Can we prescind from that and say, no, together, through argumentation, we're seeking the truth. And if we find it, it'll link us together. But it's a spiritual discipline we're talking about. And that's lacking in a lot of the social media culture.
Do you find, I've always thought that, in a way, the magic bullet to cut through all of this is friendship.
Yeah.
When people become friends.
Yes.
It is just so much easier to demonize a stranger than a friend. Right? And the problem is we have become such a stratified culture that it is increasingly difficult. Well, in other words, we're swimming against the tide if you want to create friendships with someone who doesn't already share your worldview. Right? So the question is, how can the church be a place in which these zones of friendship can be carved out?
It can be what it at its best always has been, a place where the virtues are inculcated. And one of those virtues is a kind of intellectual virtue, grounded, as you quite correctly say, in friendship. Because friendship means the two of us together are seeking a transcendent third. So we're not just either admiring each other or fighting with each other, just one to one. Together, we're looking to a transcendent third. In this case, the truth, the good, the beautiful. And in that measure, we get closer to each other. That's the irony of it. Is the more we forget about the one-to-one and look to the transcendent third, the closer we actually get. That's the bond of friendship. And Aquinas will say that. In love of the truth, friendship is inculcated. And the church should be a place where that's happening, where we're learning the disciplines. We do the exercises necessary to make that friendly quest of the truth possible. Yes, the church can and should, which is why it's so sad when church people are demonstrating just the opposite. I've said, and I actually have scolded whatever impact I have on the Catholic social media world, but I've scolded people by saying, do you realize an honest seeker after the Catholic truth, what is this Catholicism all about? I'm going to go on social media and find out. I'll go to a website. And what do they find? Catholics just, attacking each other. How massively disedifying, how completely un-evangelical that is. If they saw us as friends, together seeking the truth, disagreeing, refining each other's arguments, terrific. But if they saw us that we're we love each other. That would be evangelically provocative. You know?
Now, let me ask you about the difference between righteous anger and contempt. I mean, in our tradition, there is a strong emphasis on righteous anger, right?
Sure.
I mean, we can look at the Old Testament prophets.
Yeah, the prophets,
right? I mean, read Jeremiah. I mean, he could be fairly contemptuous.
Sure.
Right? Hosea, right? I mean, whether we're talking about kings or emperors, or even for that matter, their own people who they felt were failing to uphold the obligations of the covenant, right? So this idea of speaking truth to power, of legitimate outrage against hypocrisy and corruption. Right? And I know from my personal experience that when I've tried to engage in what I guess we would say is fraternal correction, right? When I try to call out a colleague, saying, hey, you kind of savaged that guy. I mean, maybe you could have been a little bit nicer about it. I mean, the usual response I get is, you're telling me to pull my punches. You're telling me to, to not speak truth, right? And so how do you think about, even from a spiritual point of view, how do you think about the difference between legitimate outrage, right? Because Augustine famously said, anger is the daughter of hope, right? There is a virtue to anger, right? So what is the difference between a legitimate outrage and contempt?
Legitimate outrage is the passion to set things right. So it's a subset of justice, that you've seen a great injustice and you want to correct it, and you have a passion to do so. So it's born of love. Love means willing the good of the other. So if I see an injustice, there's some evil being done, and I want to will the good to that person, I might be filled with righteous indignation, like the prophets, like Jesus famously in the temple, and so on. And that's a good point of demarcation. If I'm not in that frame of mind and spirit, then I've probably defaulted to real contempt, where I'm now just venting my spleen. Aquinas refers to anger as this sort of irrational desire for revenge. And look, we're all sinners. I mean, I've felt that. I know exactly what it feels like. When someone's attacked me, I want to get back. But see, it's irrational because it's not a passion to set things right. That might be, hey, let's talk this thing through, and you were really unfair to me, and let's work on this. That's okay. That's righteous anger, if you want. But anger in the sinful sense, the deadly sin of anger, is a irrational desire for vengeance. That's the point of demarcation. You've got to do a lot of introspection to look really honestly at your spiritual attitude. One thing I've told people online is, you've written something and you're about to press the enter button. Can you honestly say, I've done this out of love? I'm willing the good of the other. Now you might, and it might be even very sharp language, like, correcting somebody, but can you say honestly, I'm doing this because I love that person. I want to set something right. Or let's be honest, 90% of the time when we hit that button, it's out of an irrational desire for vengeance. So then you say, okay, don't do it. Unless you can say, yes, I'm doing this out of love, don't hit the darn button.
Look,
don't send it.
I don't have your audience, okay? But I have been in the public eye myself for more than 20 years. And if there was one infallible lesson I have learned about responding to criticism, it is that I have never, ever regretted being gracious in the face of criticism. I have often regretted being defensive. Right?
Right, but I mean, we're all fallen, we're all sinners, and so we have these deep instincts in the wrong direction. Think of the old spiritual masters talking about the way our desires and our emotions are all messed up because of sin. And so, I mean, why do we feel so naturally this irrational desire for revenge? And why is real love so difficult?
Original sin? Maybe it would be.
Right, and that's the right answer. And the church has always known about that. And we let that doctrine sink in as well. That, all right, I am so marked by this, concupiscence, my emotions are messed up. So be careful. Be aware of that. And
I remember that famous line from Chesterton, right? This is the.
There's so many. Which one from Chesterton?
Well, the early 20th century, right, where he said, modern science is very impressed with the need to begin their speculations with a fact. So, Christianity begins with a fact as plain as potatoes, which is the fact of original sin.
There it is.
Right?
I feel it in myself all the time. And social media brings that out. I mean, it's like he presses that button on it, bop, 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 all the time. I mean, I feel all the time. You've done something, you've written an article, you've done a video, and then someone makes a obnoxious comment. It's just pressing this button in your own psyche. So we got to be aware of that and seek a detachment, interior freedom. All the
Which
old
requires
spiritual
time,
disciplines,
right?
Yes,
I mean, and that is that's the commodity that is missing in the contemporary media environment, right?
Yes.
Where we live with perennial immediacy.
yes, but it takes a real spiritual discipline, and that's the ultimate answer, and it's not an easy one. Do you censor things if people are saying bad things about you, or do you work on yourself? Do you work on your own interiority, your own spiritual freedom? That's hard spiritual work, but that's...
Well, you raise the issue of censorship. I mean, let me
Yeah.
ask you, you are a bishop of the Catholic Church, and therefore you were charged, in a sense, with, at least in your own diocese, with distinguishing
Yeah.
what is authentically Catholic
Yeah.
and what is not. So let me ask you this. Suppose there was some Catholic media outfit that you felt was toxic, that was feeding a culture of contempt, that had somehow set up shop in the Diocese of Winona, Rochester. What do you do? I mean, do you try to sanction them? Do you call them out? How do you engage them?
Well, different things you can do. At the limit, you can take away their kind of status as a Catholic organization. As a bishop, I could do that. I can't really, stop them from broadcasting, but I do think a bishop has a legitimate monitoring responsibility. We do it with textbooks. We do it with catechetical programs. We do it with university professors, with the whole mandatum. So I don't have a quarrel with that. I think bishops should monitor the Wild West quality of social media space. There are a lot of very irresponsible people out there in that space. And sadly, a lot of Catholics get their information and their formation from people who are patently unqualified. So I don't really have a quarrel with that a bishop could, you do it in different ways. You'd follow the mandatum, like you give a special sanction to certain outfits and refuse it to others, but in some way to monitor the space. I, in fact, brought that up at the Synod here, because I think that's, if we do it with books and catechetical programs in universities, why wouldn't we do it with the social media
Okay, but just to
space?
play devil's advocate for a
Yeah.
moment, which, of course, that office has been suppressed, but nevertheless, just to trot it out for purposes of this conversation, I've covered the Vatican a long time, and I have seen instances in which theologians, for instance, have been sanctioned in some way by the Holy Office, the Congregation now the Dicastery for the Faith. I can recall cases in which theologians whose books had sold a couple dozen copies
now sell
suddenly get
500,000.
sanctioned by the Vatican, and all of a sudden they become international celebrities.
Sure.
And so the question is, don't you worry that the long arm of officialdom reaching out might actually end up being counterproductive?
Yeah, it could be. And it's a case-by-case thing, probably. But that's why I say some kind of shepherding or monitoring of your own diocese. I think that's a legitimate thing. And before you get to that point, call the person in, have a good conversation with them and say, look, why are you saying X, Y, and Z, which are clearly, repugnant to the church's teaching or clearly harmful to people. So there are steps you can take before you get to the point of,
And have you tried that with people that you have considered responsible for contempt?
I have not. For the first time now, I'm bishop in my own diocese, so I'd have that kind of authority. Prior to that, I wouldn't have had the authority to do it. But I think there are steps, preliminary steps you might take, before you get to sanctioning somebody.
Yeah, I mean, this is something I have thought about, for a long time too, right? Is when you have a situation in which the church is, and I don't think it's polarized. We use that word, right? But I don't think that's accurate, because that suggests that everyone is clustered either into the left or the right. I think what we actually are is tribalized. Because if you increase the magnification, right, on both sides of the aisle, what you will find is, you've got peace and justice Catholics, and you've got church reform Catholics, and you've got liturgical traditionalist Catholics, and you've got, neocon Catholics, right? And they all inhabit their own little universes, and they have their own heroes, and they read their own blogs, and they go to their own conferences, and they don't really have much to do with one another, right? And so the question is, how do you puncture, right, all of that? My experience would suggest that chiding people about it, generally speaking, doesn't produce positive effects. I hate to be naive and reductionist about it, but at the end of the day, I have become an advocate of the better to light a candle than curse the darkness philosophy, right? It's just better to show that there is a different way of doing things than to explicitly call out, and even worse, to try to sanction through, impositions of authority, right?
Yeah, again, I would say case by case, because some are so egregious that something has to be done or something has to be imposed, or people would start doing real damage. But to your broader point, I quite agree with that. What I've tried to do in my own work, relying on my mentor, Cardinal George, is just Catholicism. As you say, all these different types of Catholicism. There is a kind of mere Catholicism, which is, I'd say, it's the classic stuff. It's the truth and the beauty of the fundamental realities of Catholicism. And I've kind of traded in that. I've not, for the most part, gotten into the tribal warfare scene in the Catholic Church. My Catholicism series, on purpose, didn't go into hot button issues. And a lot of people were urging me to do it, from both the left and the right. And I refused it. I wanted to bring out these really fundamental and beautiful, compelling features of Catholicism. And I've tried to be positive. I mean, occasionally I might write an article with a little polemical edge, but I tend to be positive. I tend to look for the seeds of the word within the culture and all that. And I found that to be a better way to do it.
And at the end of the day, this effort to go positive, what I will often hear from colleagues when I talk about this is, that's pie in the sky stuff. That's not where the market is, right? What they will say is that in the media market in which we live, it rewards the kind of attack dog style of things and does not reward efforts to claim the common ground. I mean, the theory is politically we live in a time in which the middle has disappeared, right? And all we have are the hard edges on either side. Now, it would seem to me that in a way the story of Word on Fire contradicts that hypothesis. I mean, what you have done is you have built a phenomenally successful media operation, not just by Catholic standards, but even by secular standards, that hasn't reflected that hard edge.
Right.
So what is your diagnosis of the market really?
Yeah, I think that's right. What you said at the outset, certainly, even the way that the machinery of the system is set up, it favors polemics and it favors, it's like the car wreck by the side of the road. Oh, everyone wants to pull over and look at that. What are they fighting about now? But I've just trusted that if you bring forth the truth and the beauty of the tradition, people will find that compelling. Maybe not immediately. It might take time to build up the interest in the audience. But I think, posse sequitur esse, as the medieval said, that possibility follows being. So if it is, it must be possible, and we prove that you can do it.
If it has been done, it can be done.
If it really is, then it must be possible.
Yeah.
So, and I'm happy about that. I'm proud of it. I think we took a path that people urged us not to take. You go back to the early days, be as pop as you can. That was one suggestion. Not wear a Roman collar, come in on a skateboard, all that nonsense. But then also this path is, be polemical and, take on your opponents and attack people. No. So we tried to do it, I think, in a responsible way, and we did find an audience.
Now, of course, what you're doing is evangelization. What I do is journalism.
Yeah.
Do you think the same principle applies? I mean, is it possible to treat contentious, divisive issues in the life of the church in a respectful way?
No, and I would say with you, posse sequitur esse. You do it, therefore it must be possible.
Yeah, we don't quite have your audience, but we do exist.
But things, I mean, we're both old enough to remember that Walter Cronkite and David Brinkley, and I long for those days.
Yeah.
When the news was the news, and you didn't really know what the private opinion of the person was, and there was an objectivity, there was a certain calmness in the way things were presented. I mean, I can't watch much of the news anymore. I love politics and current events, but I can't watch those shows. I mean, because there's the bias and the polemicism is so off-putting to me. Bring back Walter Cronkite, and I think he embodied that style. It was done seriously, it was done objectively, never perfectly. Everyone's always got a certain bias, but at least they were defaulting in that direction.
So, Bishop, last question. At the end of the day, Catholicism isn't contempt. It is, in fact, the precise opposite of contempt, right? It's the effort to perceive and to celebrate the inherent dignity, the beauty, and the truth, however limited or partial it may be,
Right.
in everyone we meet, and in every expression of human culture, right? And the famous line, nothing human is alien to us, right? So my question to you is, why is it that this culture of contempt, despite that great truth, why is it that it has taken hold? And where do you find hope that this is a passing phenomenon that in the end will correct itself?
Well, it's taken hold because we're sinners and because that's all been exacerbated by this new form of social media. I think that's the answer. The hope, I think, comes from our redemption. It comes from Christ. It comes from the church, that people are not just destined to be stuck forever in the cycle of sin and retribution and hatred, but there really is a way out, and the church is meant to be a haven for that. So I find hope in the saints. I find hope in the sacraments, hope in the preaching of the church, which is, again, why it's so sad, corruptio optimi pessima. It's so sad when it's precisely the Catholic space that can become so poisonous, because the Catholic space is meant to be the source of our hope, and I think it is. It's from the saints that we always take hope.
You speak about the Catholic space. I mean, our pretense is to be evangelizers of culture, right?
Yeah.
But the truth is, in many ways, we are actually evangelized by culture.
Sadly,
right?
yeah.
And the way in which we treat one another in the public conversation in the church is often exhibit A for that phenomenon. Right?
That's the sad thing. I mean, who positions whom? And I'm with the post-liberals in saying, that Christ must always have that positioning relationship to the culture. It's not just Christ next to the culture, not just Christ absorbed by the culture. It's Christ who positions the culture. As Vatican II says, we read the signs of the times in light of the gospel. It's in light of Christ that we interpret the world. That's the right attitude for Catholics to have, is we see everything through the lens of Christ.
Well, look, I mean, when I am asked by people, when I'm on the lecture circuit or I'm on TV or just in casual conversation, when people ask me, where does my hope come from that we can have a public conversation about Catholicism that is beyond contempt? Invariably, I mention Word on Fire.
Oh, good.
Because it seems to me that of all the different, sort of expressions of Catholicism that are on offer in today's media smorgasbord, at least in the English language, not only are you non-contemptuous, but you have succeeded by being non-contemptuous. And that is a remarkable accomplishment.
I appreciate that, John. I do very much. And
so for what you have done, Bishop, thank you.
Well, God bless you. Thank you for that.
So the book is Catholics at Contempt, How Catholic Media Fuel Today's Fights in the Church and What to Do About It. It is published by the Word on Fire Institute, which is, of course, the brainchild of Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop, listen, much luck in surviving the rest of the Synod of Bishops. Remember, this is a marathon, not a sprint.
You're right.
Conserve your energies.
You're right.
All right. Thank you for being with us. Good night.